Part 2 of Medal of Honor by Mac Reynolds. Part 2. Afterwards, alone in New Washington, and wanting to remain alone, Don Mathers strolled the streets for a time, bothered only occasionally when someone recognized his face, and people would stop and applaud. He grinned inwardly. He had a suspicion already that after a time he'd get used to it, and weary to death of it. But right now, it was still new and fun. Who was the flyer way back in history? The one who first flew the Atlantic in a propeller-driven aircraft? His popularity must have been something like this. He went into O'Donnell's at lunchtime, and as he entered, the orchestra broke off the popular tune they were playing and struck up the interplanetary anthem. The manager himself escorted him to his table and made suggestions as to the specialties and the wine. When he first sat down, the other occupants of the restaurant, men and women, had stood and faced him and applauded. Don flushed. There could be too much of a good thing. After the meal, a fantastic production, Don finished his cigar and asked the head waiter for his bill, reaching for his wallet. The other smiled. "Captain, I am afraid your money is of no value in O'Donnell's. Not for just this luncheon, but whenever you honor us." The head waiter paused and added, "In fact, Captain, I doubt if there is a restaurant in the solar system where your money holds value, or that there will ever be." Don Mathers was taken aback. He was only beginning to realize the ramifications of his holding his Galactic Medal of Honor. At Space Command Headquarters, 3rd Division, Don came to attention before the Commodore's desk and tossed the other a salute. The Commodore returned it snappily and leaned back in his chair. "Take a seat, Captain. Nice to see you again," he added pleasantly. "Where in the world have you been?" Don Mathers slumped into a chair, said wearily, "On a bust. The bust to end all busts." The Commodore chuckled. "Don't blame you," he said. "It was quite a bust," Don said. "Well," the Commodore chuckled again, "I don't suppose we can throw you in the guardhouse for being a WOL, not in view of your recent decoration." There was nothing to say to that. "By the way," the Commodore said, "I haven't had the opportunity to congratulate you on your Cradin. That was quite a feat, Captain." "Thank you, sir," Don said modestly. "Rather foolish of me, I suppose." "Very much so. On such foolishness are heroic deeds based." The Commodore looked at him questioningly. "You must have had incredible luck. The only way we've been able to figure it was that his detectors were on the blink. That may be what happened." "Yes, sir." Don nodded quickly. "That's the way I figure it, and my first blast must have disrupted his fire control or something." The Commodore said, "He didn't get in any return fire at all?" "A few blasts, but by that time I was in too close and moving too fast. Fact of the matter is, sir, I don't think they ever recovered from my first beaming of them." "No, I suppose not," the Commodore said musingly. "It's a shame you had to burn them so badly. We've never recovered a Cradin ship in good enough shape to give our techs something to work on. It might make a basic difference in the war, particularly if there was something aboard that'd give us some indication of where they were coming from. We've been fighting this war in our backyard for a full century. It would help if we could get into their backyard for a change. It's problematic how long we'll be able to hold them off at this rate." Don Mathers said uncomfortably, "Well, it's not as bad as all that, sir. We've held them this far." His superior grunted. "We've held them this far because we've been able to keep out enough patrol ships to give us ample warning when one of their task forces come in. Do you know how much fuel that consumes, Captain?" "Well, I know it's a lot." "So much so that Earth's industry is switching back to petroleum and coal. Every ounce of radioactives is needed by the fleet. Even so, it's just a matter of time." Don Mathers pursed his lips. I didn't know it was that bad. The Commodore smiled sourly at him. I'm afraid I'm being a wet blanket thrown over your big bust of a celebration, Captain. Tell me, how does it feel to hold the system's highest award? Don shook his head, marveling. Fantastic, sir. Of course, like any member of the services, I've always known of the Medal of Honor, but, well, nobody ever expects to get it, he added wryly. Certainly not while he's still alive and in health. Why, sir, do you realize that I haven't been able to spend 1 unit of money since? There was an element of awe in his voice. Sir, do you realize that not even a beggar will take currency from me? The Commodore nodded in appreciation. You must understand the position you occupy, Captain. Your feat was inspiring enough, but that's not all of it. In a way, you combine a popular hero with an unknown soldier element. Awarding you the Galactic Medal of Honor makes a symbol of you, a symbol representing all the millions of unsung heroes and heroines who have died fighting for the human species. It's not a light burden to carry on your shoulders, Captain Mathers. I would imagine it a very humbling honor. Well, yes, sir, Don said. The Commodore switched his tone of voice. That brings us to the present and what your next assignment is to be. Obviously, it wouldn't do for you to continue in a scout. Big Brass seems to be in favor of using you for morale, and Don Mathers cleared his throat and interrupted. Sir, I've decided to drop out of the space service. Drop out? The other stared at Mathers, uncomprehending. We're at war, Captain. Don nodded seriously. Yes, sir, but what you just said is true. I couldn't be used any longer in a scout. I'd wind up selling bonds and giving talks to old ladies' clubs. Well, hardly that, Captain. No, sir. I think I'd really be of more use out of the services. I'm tendering my resignation and making arrangements to help in the developing of Callisto and the other Jupiter satellites. The Commodore said nothing. His lips seemed whiter than before. Don Mathers said doggedly, Perhaps my prestige will help bring volunteers to work the new mines out there. If they see me, well, sacrificing, putting up with the hardships. The Commodore said evenly, Mr. Mathers, I doubt if you will ever have to put up with hardships again, no matter where you make your abode. However, good luck. You deserve it. Outside headquarters, Don Mathers summoned a cab and dialed his hotel. On the way over, he congratulated himself. It had gone easier than he had expected, really. Although, come to think of it, there wasn't a damn thing that the brass could do. He had to laugh to himself. Imagine if he'd walked in on the Commodore a month ago and announced that he was going to drop out of the space service. He would have been dropped all right. Right into the lap of a squadron of psycho experts. At the hotel, he shucked his uniform, an action which gave him considerable gratification, and dressed in one of the scores of civilian costumes that filled his closets to overflowing. He took pleasure in estimating what this clothing must have cost in terms of space service pay for a sub-lieutenant or even a captain. Years, my boys, years. He looked at himself in the dressing-room mirror with satisfaction, then turned to the auto bar and dialed himself a stone-age-old Metaxa. He'd lost his taste for the plebeian tequila in the last few days. He held the old Greek brandy in the light and wondered pleasurably what the stuff cost per pony glass. Happily, he'd never have to find out. He tossed the drink down and, whistling, took his private elevator to the garages in the second level of the hotel's basement floors. He selected a limousine and dialed the Interplanetary Lines building. He left the car at the curb before the main entrance, ignoring all traffic regulations, and entered the building, still whistling softly and happily to himself. He grinned when a small crowd gathered outside and smiled and clapped their hands. He grinned and waved at them. A receptionist hurried to him, and he told her he wanted to see either Mr. Demming or Mr. Rostov, And then when she offered to escort him personally, he noticed her pixie-like cuteness and said, "What are you doing tonight, miss?" Her face went pale. "Oh, anything, sir," she said weakly. He grinned at her. "Maybe I'll take you up on that if I'm not too busy." He had never seen anyone so taken aback. She said, all flustered, "I'm Tony Fitzgerald. You can just call this building and ask for me any time." "Maybe I'll do that," he smiled. "But now let's see Old Man Demming." That took her back, too. Aside from being asked for a date, if asked could be the term, by the system's greatest celebrity, she was hearing for the first time the interplanetary tycoon being called Old Man Demming. She said, "Oh, right this way, Captain Mathers." Don said, "Mr. Mathers now, I'm afraid. I have new duties." She looked up into his face. "You'll always be Captain Mathers to me, sir," she added softly and irrelevantly. "My two brothers were lost on the Minerva in that action last year off Pluto." She took a deep breath, which only stressed her figure. "I've applied 6 times for space service, but they won't take me." They were in an elevator now. Don said, "That's too bad, Tony. However, the space service isn't as romantic as you might think." "Yes, sir," Tony Fitzgerald said, her soul in her eyes. "You ought to know, sir." Don was somehow irritated. He said nothing further until they reached the upper stories of the gigantic office building. He thanked her after she turned him over to another receptionist. Don Mathers' spirits had been restored by the time he was brought to the door of Max Rostroff's office. His new guide evidently hadn't even bothered to check on the man's availability before ushering Mathers into the other's presence. Max Rostroff looked up from his desk, wolfishly aggressive looking as ever. "Why, Captain," he said, "how fine to see you again. Come right in. Martha, that will be all." Martha gave the interplanetary hero one more long look and then turned and left. As soon as the door closed behind her, Max Rostroff turned and snarled, "Where have you been, you rummy?" He couldn't have shocked Don Mathers more if he'd suddenly sprouted a unicorn's horn. "We've been looking for you for a week," Rostroff snapped. "Out of one bar into another, our men couldn't catch up with you. Damn it! Don't you realize we've got to get going? We've got a dozen documents for you to sign. We've got to get this thing underway before somebody else does." Don blurted, "You can't talk to me that way." It was the other's turn to stare. Max Rostroff said, low and dangerously, "No? Why can't I?" Don glared at him. Max Rostroff said, "Let's get this straight, Mathers. To everybody else but Demming and me, you might be the biggest hero in the solar system. But you know what you are to us?" Don felt his indignation seeping from him. "To us," Max Rostroff said flatly, "you're just another demi-buttocked incompetent on the make." He added definitely, "And make no mistake, Mathers, you'll continue to have a good thing out of this only as long as we can use you." A voice from behind them said, "Let me add to that. Period. End of paragraph." It was Lawrence Demming, who'd just entered from an inner office. He said, even his voice seemed flat, "And now that's settled, I'm going to call in some lawyers. While they're around, we conduct ourselves as though we're 3 equal partners. On paper, we will be." "Wait a minute now," Don blurted. "What do you think you're pulling? The agreement was we split this whole thing 3 ways." Demming's jowls wobbled as he nodded. "That's right. And your share of the loot is your Galactic Medal of Honor. That and the dubious privilege of having the whole thing in your name. You'll keep your medal and we'll keep our share." He growled heavily. "You don't think you're getting the short end of the stick, do you?" Max Rostroff said, "Let's knock this off and get the law boys in. We've got enough paperwork to keep us busy the rest of the week." He sat down again at his desk and looked up at Don. "Then we'll all be taking off for Callisto to get things underway. With any luck, in 6 months we'll have every ounce of pitchblende left in the system sewed up." There was a crowd awaiting his ship at the Callisto spaceport. A crowd modest by Earth standards, but representing a large percentage of the small population of Jupiter's moon. On the way out, a staff of the system's best speechwriters and 2 top professional actors had been working with him. Don Mathers gave a short preliminary talk at the spaceport, and then the important one, the one that was broadcast throughout the system that night from his suite at the hotel. He'd been well rehearsed, and they'd kept him from the bottle except for 2 or 3 quick ones immediately before going on. "The project at hand is to extract the newly discovered deposits of pitchblende on these satellites of Jupiter." He paused impressively before continuing. "It's a job that cannot be done in slipshod, haphazard manner. The system's need for radioactives cannot be overstressed. In short, fellow humans, we must allow nothing to stand in the way of all-out unified effort to do this job quickly and efficiently. My associates and I have formed a corporation to manage this crash program. We invite all to participate by purchasing stock. I will not speak of profits, fellow humans, because in this emergency we all scorn them. However, as I say, you are invited to participate. Some of the preliminary mining concessions are at present in the hands of individuals or small corporations. It will be necessary that these turn over their holdings to our single, all-embracing organization for the sake of efficiency. Our experts will evaluate such holdings and recompense the owners." Don Mathers paused again for emphasis. "This is no time for quibbling. All must come in. If there are those who put private gain before the needs of the system, then pressures must be found to be exerted against them. We will need thousands and tens of thousands of trained workers to operate our mines, our mills, our refineries. In the past, skilled labor here on the satellites was used to double or even triple the wage rate on Earth and the settled planets and satellites. I need only repeat, this is no time for personal gain and quibbling. The corporation announces proudly that it will pay only prevailing Earth rates. We will not insult our employees by bribing them to patriotism through higher wages." There was more along the same lines. It was all taken very well, indeed, with enthusiasm. On the 3rd day, at an office conference, Don waited for an opening to say, "Look, somewhere here on Callisto is a young woman named Diane Fuller. After we get me established in an office, I'd like her to be my secretary." Deming looked up from some reports he was scanning. He grunted to Max Rostov, "Tell him," and went back to the papers. Max Rostov settled back into his chair. He said to the 2 bodyguards stationed at the door, "Scotty, Rogers, go and make the arrangements to bring that damn prospector into line." When they were gone, Rostov turned back to Don Mathers. "You don't need an office, Mathers. All you need is to go back to your bottles. Just don't belt it so hard that you can't sign papers every time we need a signature." Don flushed angrily. "Look, don't push me, you 2. You need me. Plenty. In fact, from what I can see, this corporation needs me more than it does you." He looked scornfully at Deming. "Originally, the idea was that you put up the money." "What money?" "We have 51% of the stock in my name, but all the credit units needed are coming from sales of stock." He turned to Rostov. "You were supposed to put up the brains." "What brains?" "We've hired the best mining engineers, the best technicians to do their end, the best corporation executives to handle that end. You're not needed." Deming grunted amusement at the short speech, but didn't bother to look up from his perusal. Max Rostov's face had grown wolfishly thin in his anger. "Look, Bottle Baby," he sneered. "You're the only one that's vulnerable in this setup. There's not a single thing that Deming and I can be held to account for. You have no beefs coming for that matter. You're getting everything you ever wanted. You've got the best suite in the best hotel on Callisto. You eat the best food the solar system provides, and most important of all to a rummy, you drink the best booze and as much of it as you want. What's more, unless either Deming or I go to the bother, you'll never be exposed. You'll live your life out being the biggest hero in the system." It was Don Mather's turn to sneer. "What do you mean I'm the only one vulnerable? There's no evidence against me, Rostov, and you know it. Who'd listen to you if you sounded off? I burned that Kraden cruiser until there wasn't a sign to be found that would indicate it wasn't in operational condition when I first spotted it." Deming grunted his amusement again. Max Rostov laughed sourly. "Don't be an ass, Mathers. We took a series of photos of that derelict when we stumbled on it. Not only can we prove you didn't knock it out, we can prove that it was in good shape before you worked it over. I imagine the fleet technician would have loved to have seen the inner workings of that Kraden cruiser before you loused it up." Deming chuckled flatly. "I wonder what kind of a court-martial they give a hero who turns out to be a saboteur." He ran into her finally after he'd been on Callisto for nearly 8 months. Actually, he didn't remember the circumstances of their meeting. He was in an alcoholic daze, and the fog rolled out, and there she was across the table from him. Don shook his head and looked about the room. They were in some sort of night spot. He didn't recognize it. He licked his lips, scowled at the taste of stale vomit. He slurred, "Hello, Di." Diane Fuller said, "Hi, Don." He said, I must have blanked out. Guess I've been hitting it too hard." She laughed at him. "You mean you don't remember all the things you've been telling me the past 2 hours?" She was obviously quite sober. Diane never had been much for the sauce. Don looked at her narrowly. "What have I been telling you for the past 2 hours?" "Mostly about how it was when you were a little boy, about fishing, and your first .22 rifle, and the time you shot the squirrel and then felt so sorry." "Oh," Don said. He ran his right hand over his mouth. There was a champagne bucket beside him, but the bottle in it was empty. He looked about the room for a waiter. Diane said gently, "Do you really think you need any more, Don?" He looked across the table at her. She was as beautiful as ever. No, that wasn't right. She was pretty, but not beautiful. She was just a damn pretty girl, not one of these glamour items. Don said, "Look, I can't remember. Did we get married?" Her laugh tinkled. "Married? I only ran into you 2 or 3 hours ago." She hesitated before saying further, "I had assumed that you were deliberately avoiding me. Callisto isn't that big." Don Mathers said slowly, "Well, if we're not married, let me decide when I want another bottle of the grape, eh?" Diane flushed. "Sorry, Don." The head waiter approached, bearing another magnum of vintage wine. He beamed at Don Mathers. "Having a good time, sir?" "Okay," Don said shortly. When the other was gone, he downed a full glass, felt the fumes almost immediately. He said to Diane, "I haven't been avoiding you, Di. We just haven't met. The way I remember, the last time we saw each other, back on Earth, you gave me quite a slap in the face. The way I remember, you didn't think I was hero enough for you." He poured another glass of the champagne. Di's face was still flushed. She said, her voice low, "I misunderstood you, Don." Even after your brilliant defeat of that Kraden cruiser, I admit, think I basically misunderstood you. I told myself that it could have been done by any pilot of a scout, given that 1 in a million break. It just happened to be you who made that suicide dive attack that succeeded. 1,000 other pilots might also have taken the 1,000,000 to 1 suicide chance rather than let the Kraden escape. Yeah, Don said. Even in his alcohol, he was surprised at her words. He said gruffly, "Sure, anybody might have done it. Pure luck. But why'd you change your mind about me then? How come the switch of heart?" "Because of what you've done since, darling." He closed one eye, the better to focus. "Since?" He recognized the expression in her eyes, a touch of star gleam. That little girl back on Earth, the receptionist at the Interplanetary Lines building, she'd had it. In fact, in the past few months, Don had seen it in many feminine faces, and all for him. Diane said, "Instead of cashing in on your prestige, you've been devoting yourself to something even more necessary to the fight than bringing down individual Kraden cruisers." Don looked at her. He could feel a nervous tick beginning in his left eyebrow. Finally, he reached for the champagne again and filled his glass. He said, "You really go for this hero stuff, don't you?" She said nothing, but the starshine was still in her eyes. He made his voice deliberately sour. "Look, suppose I ask you to come back to my apartment with me tonight." "Yes," she said softly. "And told you to bring your overnight bag along," he added brutally. Diane looked into his face. "Why are you twisting your inner self so hard, Don? Of course I'll come, if that's what you wanted." "And then," he said flatly, "suppose I kicked you out in the morning." Diane winced, but she kept her eyes even with his, her own moist now. "You forget," she whispered. "You have been awarded the Galactic Medal of Honor, the bearer of which can do no wrong." "Oh, God," Don muttered. He filled his glass, still again, motioned to a nearby waiter. "Yes, sir," the waiter said. Don said, "Look, in about 5 minutes I'm going to pass out. See that I get back to my hotel, will you? And that this young lady gets to her home. And waiter, just send my bill to the hotel, too." The other bowed. "The owner's instructions, sir, are that Captain Mathers must never see a bill in this establishment." Diane said, "Don!" He didn't look at her. He raised his glass to his mouth, and shortly afterward the fog rolled in again. When it rolled out, the unfamiliar taste of black coffee was in his mouth. He shook his head for clarity. He seemed to be in some working-class restaurant. Next to him in a booth was a fresh-faced sub-lieutenant of the— Don squinted at the collar tabs. Yes, of the Space Service. A scout pilot. Don stuttered, "What's going on?" The pilot said apologetically, "Sub-Lieutenant Pierpont, sir. You seemed so far under the weather, I took over." "Oh, you did, eh?" "Well, yes, sir. You were, well, reclining in the gutter, sir. In spite of your, well, appearance, your condition, I recognized you, sir." "Oh." His stomach was an objecting turmoil. The lieutenant said, "Want to try some more of this coffee now, sir? Or maybe some soup or a sandwich?" Don groaned. "Oh, no, no, thanks. Don't think I could hold it down." The pilot grinned. "You must have thrown a classic, sir." "I guess so. What time is it?" "No, that doesn't make any difference. What's the date?" Pierpont told him. It was hard to believe. The last he could remember, he'd been with Di in some nightclub. He wondered how long ago that had been. He fumbled in his clothes for a smoke and couldn't find one. He didn't want it anyway. He growled at the lieutenant. Well, I'll go the one-man scouts. Pierpont grinned at him. Glad to be out of them, sir? Usually. Pierpont looked at him strangely. I don't blame you, I suppose, but it isn't as bad these days as it used to be while you were still in the space service, sir. Don grunted. How come? 2 weeks to a month all by yourself, watching the symptoms of space cafard progress. Then 3 weeks of leave to get drunk in. Then another stretch in space. The pilot snorted depreciation. That's the way it used to be. He fingered the spoon of his coffee cup. That's the way it still should be, of course, but it isn't. They're spreading the duty around now, and I spend less than 1 week out of 4 on patrol. Don hadn't been listening too closely, but now he looked up. What do you mean? Pierpont said, I mean, sir, I suppose this isn't bridging security, seeing who you are, but fuel stocks are so low that we can't maintain full patrols any more. There was a cold emptiness in Don Mathers' stomach. He said, Look, I'm still woozy. Say that again, Lieutenant. The lieutenant told him again. Don Mathers rubbed the back of his hand over his mouth and tried to think. He said, finally, Look, Lieutenant, first, let's get another cup of coffee into me and maybe that sandwich you were talking about. Then would you help me to get back to my hotel? By the 4th day, his hands weren't trembling any longer. He ate a good breakfast, dressed carefully, then took a hotel limousine down to the offices of the Mathers, Deming, and Rostov Corporation. At the entrance to the inner sanctum, the heavy-set Scotty looked up at his approach. He said, The boss has been looking for you, Mr. Mathers, but right now you ain't got no appointment, have you? Him and Mr. Rostov is having a big conference. He says to keep everybody out. That doesn't apply to me, Scotty, Don snapped. Get out of my way. Scotty stood up reluctantly, but barred the way. He said it applied to everybody, Mr. Mathers. Don put his full weight into a blow that started at his waist, dug deep into the other's middle. Scott doubled forward, his eyes bugging. Don Mathers gripped his hands together into a double fist and brought them upward in a vicious uppercut. Scotty fell forward and to the floor. Don stood above him momentarily, watchful for movement which didn't develop. The hefty bodyguard must have been doing some easy living himself. He wasn't as tough as he looked. Don knelt and fished from under the other's left arm a vicious-looking, short-barreled scrambler. He tucked it under his own jacket into his belt, then turned, opened the door, and entered the supposedly barred office. Deming and Rostov looked up from their work across a double desk. Both scowled. Rostov opened his mouth to say something, and Don Mathers rapped, Shut up. Rostov blinked at him. Deming leaned back in his swivel chair. You're sober for a change, he wheezed almost accusingly. Don Mathers pulled up a stenographer's chair and straddled it, leaning his arms on the back. He said coldly, Comes a point when even the lowest worm turns. I've been checking on a few things. Deming grunted amusement. Don said, Space patrols have been cut far below the danger point. Rostov snorted. Is that supposed to interest us? That's the problem of the military and the government. Oh, it interests us all right, Don growled. Currently, Mathers, Deming, and Rostov control probably 3/4 of the system's radioactives. Deming said in greasy satisfaction, More like 4/5. Why? Don said bluntly. Why are we doing what we're doing? They both scowled, but another element was present in their expressions, too. They thought the question unintelligent. Deming closed his eyes in his porcine manner and grunted, Tell him. Rostov said, Look, Mathers, don't be stupid. Remember when we told you during that first interview that we wanted your name in the corporation, among other reasons, because we could use a man who was above law? that a maze of ridiculously binding ordinances have been laid on business down through the centuries? I remember, Don said bitterly. Well, it goes both ways. Government today is also bound very strongly, and even in great emergency, not to interfere in business. These complicated laws balance each other, as you might say. Our whole legal system is based upon them. Right now, we've got government right where we want it. This is free enterprise, Mathers, at its pinnacle. Did you ever hear of Jim Fisk and his attempt to corner gold in 1869? The so-called Black Friday affair? Well, Jim Fisk was a peanut peddler compared to us. What's this got to do with the fleet having insufficient fuel to... Don Mathers stopped as comprehension hit him. You're holding our radioactives off the market, pressuring the government for a price rise which it can't afford. Deming opened his eyes and said flatly, for triple the price, Mathers. But before we're through, we'll corner half the wealth of the system. Don said, But the species is at war. Rostov sneered. You seem to be getting noble rather late in the game, Mathers. Business is business. Don Mathers was shaking his head. We immediately began selling our radioactives at cost of production. I might remind you, gentlemen, that although we're supposedly a three-way partnership, actually, everything's in my name. You thought you had me under your thumb so securely that it was safe, and you probably didn't trust each other. Well, I'm blowing the whistle. Surprisingly fast for such a fat man, Lawrence Deming's hand flitted into a desk drawer to emerge with a twin of the scrambler tucked in Don's belt. Don Mathers grinned at him, even as he pushed his jacket back to reveal the butt of his own weapon. He made no attempt to draw it, however. He said softly, Shoot me, Deming, and you've killed the most popular man in the solar system. You'd never escape the gas chamber, no matter how much money you have. On the other hand, if I shoot you... He put a hand into his pocket, and it emerged with a small, inordinately ordinary bit of ribbon and metal. He displayed it on his palm. The fat man's face whitened at the ramifications, and his hand relaxed to let the gun drop to the desk. Listen, Don, he broke out. We've been unrealistic with you. We'll reverse ourselves and split, honestly, split three ways. Don Mathers laughed at him. Trying to bribe me with money, Deming? Why don't you realize that I'm the only man in existence who has no need for money, who can't spend money? That my fellow men, whom I've done such a good job of betraying, have honored me to a point where money is meaningless? Rostov snatched up the fallen gun, snarling, I'm calling your bluff, you gutless rummy. Don Mathers said, Okay, Rostov. There's just two other things I want to say first. One, I don't care if I die or not. Two, you're only 20 feet or so away, but you know what? I think you're probably a lousy shot. I don't think you've had much practice. I think I can get my scrambler out and cut you down before you can finish me. He grinned thinly. Wanna try? Max Rostov snarled a curse and his finger whitened on the trigger. Don Mathers fell sideways, his hand streaking for his weapon. Without thought there came back to him the long hours of training in hand weapons, in judo, in hand-to-hand combat. He went into action with cool confidence. At the spaceport, he took a cab to the presidential palace. It was an auto cab, of course, and at the palace gates he found he had no money on him. He snorted wearily. It was the first time in almost a year that he'd had to pay for anything. 4 sentries were standing at attention. He said, Do one of you boys have some coins to feed into this slot? I'm fresh out. A sergeant grinned, approached, and did the necessary. Don Mathers said wearily, I don't know how you go about this. I don't have an appointment, but I want to see the president. We can turn you over to one of the assistant secretaries, Captain Mathers, the sergeant said. We can't go any further than that. While we're waiting, what's the chance of getting your autograph, sir? I got a kid. It wasn't nearly as complicated as he'd thought it was going to be. In half an hour, he was seated in the office where he'd received his decoration only. How long ago was it? Really less than a year? He told the story briefly, making no effort to spare himself. At the end, he stood up long enough to put a paper in front of the other, then sat down again. I'm turning the whole corporation over to the government. The president said, Wait a minute. My administration does not advocate state ownership of industry. I know. When the state controls industry, you only put the whole mess off one step. The question then becomes, who controls the state? However, I'm not arguing political economy with you, sir. You didn't let me finish. I was going to say, I'm turning it over to the government to untangle, even while making use of the inventories of radioactives. There's going to be a lot of untangling to do, reimbursing the prospectors and small operators who were blackjacked out of their holdings by our super corporation, reimbursing of the miners and the other laborers who were talked into accepting low pay in the name of patriotism. Don Mathers cut it short. Oh, it's quite a mess. Yes, the president said. And you say Max Rostov is dead? That's right. And Deming off his rocker. I think he always was a little unbalanced, and the prospect of losing all that money, the greatest fortune ever conceived of, tipped the scales. The president said, And what about you, Donald Mathers? Don took a deep breath. I wish I was back in the space services, frankly. Back where I was when all this started. However, I suppose that after my court-martial there won't be... The president interrupted gently. You seem to forget, Captain Mathers. You carry the Galactic Medal of Honor, the bearer of which can do no wrong. Don Mathers gaped at him. The president smiled, albeit a bit sourly. It would hardly do for human morale to find out our supreme symbol of heroism was a phony, Captain. There will be no trial, and you will retain your decoration. But I don't want it. I'm afraid that is the cross you'll have to bear the rest of your life, Captain Mathers. I don't suppose it will be an easy one. His eyes went to a far corner of the room, but unseeingly. He said, after a long moment, However, I am not so very sure about your not deserving your reward, Captain. End of Medal of Honor by Mac Reynolds. This recording by Phil Chenevert.